And, I think a lot of people would agree that that might be the definition of resilience, right? It is about being prepared and having an emergency backpack and knowing your hazard map and your evacuation routes. But it's also about when the disaster strikes, being able to act in the moment and make a decision depending on the situation and not follow what you've learned. And that's really surprising to me, because a lot of these, trainings and disaster organizations, have very specific things that they're teaching people. But at the end of the training or at the end of a conversation, they would say, but when the disaster strikes, forget everything we've taught you and just do what you think is right in that moment.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. Chika, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your work is really, really exciting, because to me, anytime I have an academic on that has sort of transcended two different cultures or two different worlds in a specific field, their research is always rich. Now, when it comes to anthropology, this is particularly, exciting, because you are able to sort of tell stories about how communities have developed and how thinking has developed within these communities. So talk to us about a bit about your background, sort of looking at Japan and sort of your Japanese background, and how your research was shaped by that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I was born in Japan, but when I was little, my family moved to Spain. And so we lived in Spain for 6-7 years. And then I learned English when I was 10. And when we went back to Japan, I went to the American school in Japan. And then I did my university degree in the US, but I'd never been to the US until then. So I sound American because of my educational background. My parents are Japanese, they don't speak English. Mm-hmm. And, we all spoke Spanish when I was little. So I've always been, I always grew up in between different cultures. And when I encountered anthropology, I realized that it's a discipline that asks the kinds of questions I've always asked myself. What does it mean to belong to a particular culture? What does it mean to inhabit different spaces? So I've always been interested in thinking about Japan, but from a transnational perspective. And especially because Japan is a country that has a strong ideology of homogeneity. So if you're slightly different, you get ostracized. But actually, if you look closely, Japan is a country that's been also a product of transnational interactions, contrary to ideology. And so I'm interested in projects that look at that look at how these international connections are actually also at the foundation of Japanese society and other countries as well. I've looked at Japan and Myanmar, and also now I'm looking at Japan and Chile, and how those international connections make the societies that we live in.
There's a really interesting area here, because Japan is developed so, the way of thinking about where they stand in the world changed over time so much. So at one point Japan was completely isolationist, so much so that they rejected anything foreign entering at one point in history. But then things changed over time, and then enter the era of being an empire and that sort of stuff. So how much has this imperial mindset impacted the way Japan thinks about its existing its relationships today with former colonies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that so Japan in the 20th century, 19th, 20th centuries, really as a country worked hard to, become like the West and not become a colony of the West. But then I think in the Second World War, it, it, it lost the war. It committed a lot of atrocities around the Asia Pacific. And there's this sort of there's this silence around the Second World War, this quite, I don't want to use the word shame, but yeah, there's a sort of unspoken, silence around the Second World War. There's a, great focus on Japan being a victim of the nuclear bombs, which it was. But historians have talked about how this victimization has, sort of erased the other side of the Japanese involvement in the Second World War, which was the colonization of the Asia Pacific. But interestingly, so I looked at one of the oldest Japanese NGOs in Japan that started in the 1950s. And it's been tied to a Shinto new religious movement or Shinto derived new religious movement. And Shinto is, I hesitate to say religion because there's a lot of debate about whether or not it's a religion, but let's just say, it's sort of like a religion. But it's been closely tied to politics, and especially to right-wing conservative politicians who are, even in power today. And so this organization that I looked at actually did their international development work as an extension of the imperial ambitions that they had in the Second World War and were not realized because they lost the war. So there's still, these were people in the NGO who were in their 70s, their 80s, so who were alive during the Second World War, and they had language like, they would say things like, people always say that Japan did these horrible things in the Asia Pacific, but actually we also, taught them the power of being proud of their culture, and we're teaching them things that are not Western, for example. Or they might, but then on the other hand, they would say things like, Japan today, in the 2000s or even from the 1980s, it's become so modern and westernized, and we've forgotten our traditional values. And so what we want to do is, try to encourage those kinds of traditional values that Japanese people have forgotten, but in Southeast Asia or the Asia Pacific. But this is not something that young Japanese people would say. So there's a generational gap between how people relate to, the place of Japan in the world.
So people, that it's not a broad sentiment. It's a sentiment focused on a very sort of like older age group who sort of have memories of that past.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think yes, I think there, there are older generations who, think that way, but seeing Japanese politicians today, and there's, the Conservative Party has been in power since the Second World War. And the fact that they keep getting elected, and that they have, support, I think indicates that some of those discourses have always been there, but also perhaps might be coming back. I mean, in the same way that we see that around the world, in the US or even in the UK, these sort of conservative, nationalistic, let's hark back to an era where we were powerful sort of language that is growing and becoming more and more popular. So I think there might have been a time period where young people were not drawn to that discourse, but I can't say that today, just in the same way I can't say, I can't say that their young people are not drawn to that, let's in the US or in the UK.
So it's very interesting because you point to the fact that there is this, this notion of
you're doing aid work from Japan as a responsible sort of former, colonizer or empire who was basically, tipping the balance of what the Western influence was. Now, how do people in those former colonies like Myanmar, how do they respond to the Japanese aid and the Japanese influence?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, I think I have to preface it by saying that, in anthropology, we always take into consideration our positionality. So, who is the researcher will impact the kind of data that you get and what people will tell you or not tell you. So being Japanese, I'm not sure if people didn't talk about Japanese colonialism to me in Myanmar, Burmese people, because I was Japanese, but no one really mentioned it. And what they would mention is that a kind of, the Japanese, because you're Japanese, you understand this a little bit better than a European or American, or, so there was that kind of Asian commonality language that people would say to me. So yeah, I have to say I actually didn't, when I was in Burma and Myanmar, I didn't come across any allusions or mention of Japanese colonialism, which in itself is interesting. Why weren't they talking to me about those memories? But it could be because I'm Japanese.
Yeah, I mean that's a really that's very perceptive of you, because in a lot of cases people would just be oblivious to the fact that just accept that that they don't care. But in reality, there are so many factors. But I want to go back to this point that you mentioned, which is humanitarian support is typically considered left wing. And in the case of Japan, it's tied to the right wing. Now, if you could you sort of give some context to that? Because as an outsider, I typically look at the right wing as a way of thinking, based in the UK. I can't speak for anywhere else, but a type of thinking that is very focused on the individual, very focused on small government intervention and that sort of stuff. So how does this right-wing situation work itself in Japan?
Yeah, so I don't think that, I should qualify that I don't think that all NGOs in Japan or all humanitarian work in Japan is tied to right-wing politics.
Yeah.
It's just that, so in Japan, NGOs were not really popular until I would say the 90s. So the organization I looked at, and perhaps, one or two other organizations, were the only ones that were around in the 50s, 60s, and maybe 70s. 70s was also, there was some humanitarian agencies that came into the picture. But so the organizations that came around in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I would say were more liberal, more leftist. But it's the organization I looked at, which I think has shaped a lot of Japanese development aid efforts from the government. I think that has a very strong tie to right-wing politics, and by that I mean so one is this language of Japan, in this revisionism in terms of the Second World War, this idea that Japan did good things during the Second World War. We need to rewrite history books because the history books make Japan look really evil, really bad, but actually we've done good things. So that kind of discourse, historical revisionism, is tied to conservative right-wing politicians. And the other thing is that the NGO itself had a lot of ties to conservative politicians and right-wing public figures. So in the 60s, for example, there was a president of a Japanese university who was known for really violently suppressing student protests. And he was a big supporter of this NGO that I studied. And he had strong connections to the prime minister, who was the leader of the Conservative Party. And so because of those connections, the NGO had a lot of favor among politicians and got a lot of grants A lot of projects were approved where it, that would have been really difficult for an NGO at the time. But because of those political connections, it was able to flourish as an NGO. And they did good work as well. But, interestingly, with the support of politicians who have this nationalistic sort of ideology about them, and they're a lot of their policies were also about rejecting that foreigners should not be foreigners, even those of Korean descent who have been in Japan for generations, that they should not have the right to vote, that women in Japan, people married couples have to have the same surname. And usually it means that the women take on the male, the husband's surname. And this NGO was supporting politicians who were trying to fight, the passing of laws that would allow separate surnames, saying that would lead to the destruction of family values, so on. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that kind of politics attached to this NGO.
How does that, I want to sort of try to tie a point that you mentioned at the beginning, in that Japanese society is very sort of conformist. So how does that sort of society conform when there are two sort of clear paths that you can take? Either, we want to revise history, or we want to actually just forget about all that and move forward. Is there any conforming on that topic, or is it still very divided?
That's a really good question. I guess I'm contradicting myself.
No, you're not at all. I'm being the troublemaker here.
No, it's great. I think that the homogeneity thing is an ideology, in the same way that every culture has an ideology. Like Americans might say they're individualistic, or British people might say they're individualistic, let's say. But these are ideologies and not necessarily reality. And so I think that Japan has an ideology of homogeneity, but it's it's often an ethnic and racial homogeneity. About but in fact, Japan is also multicultural, that there are these different viewpoints within the country. Yeah, but that's a really good question. I mean, I don't really know how ordinary Japanese people would square the idea that all Japanese people, don't like different, but there is different.
The reason why I asked it is because it lends itself very well to where I'm from. I'm from Iraq, and Iraq is like, looking at the situation where, like, the side where I'm from in Iraq, the South, looking at the situation there, it's also a very conformist society. And there's there's strong tradition, strong culture, strong practices. But within that, I think I tend to find that societies that have that also have strong divisions when it comes to sort of these political directions. So it's almost like a paradox, which is what I find super fascinating about what you've just described, because it's almost identical to what we see in Iraq. But I want to sort of move on to some of your more recent work, which is also quite it's unique in that you're looking at sort of disaster preparation or preparedness, but you're looking at it also from this concept of like two different cultures and how they adapt to one another. So how did that come about?
So how did that come about? I think, well, one, because I was still interested in international cooperation and international aid. And when I was finishing my field work for my PhD, which was about the Japanese development work in Myanmar, it was in 2011. And there was that big earthquake and tsunami that hit northern Japan in 2011. And I saw it when I was in Myanmar. And I was really shaken by it. And I wanted to go back and do something. And before I did my PhD, I used to work for a humanitarian NGO in Japan. They work in post-conflict and post-disaster areas around the world. And so I reached out to them and said, hey, can I help? Can I do something? And they said yes. So I finished my field work and went back to Japan in March 2011. And I ended up helping with the relief efforts, coordinating and stuff. And that made me really interested and to think more about disaster preparedness. And I wanted to also link it to the work that I already done about international cooperation. And I realized that one of the soft power messages that the Japanese government puts out is that Japan is an expert in disaster preparedness. And so they have a lot of international aid programs around teaching international experts about, disaster risk reduction. So then I thought, oh, that sounds like an interesting way to bridge my previous work on international aid, with perhaps a new topic about disasters. And since I grew up in Spain and I speak Spanish, and because Japan and Chile share, earthquakes and, similar kinds of disasters, I thought, why not Japan and Chile? And, there were very lucky encounters with people that allowed me to do that transnational research.
It's quite interesting because, having had the sort of practical background in this sort of work, and now looking at the more theoretical side, do you feel like there is, do you feel like there is a lot to be developed when it comes to disaster preparedness, or does it vary? Because from discussing before the recording, it sounds like the word kept coming up, standardization of you're trying to standardize disaster preparedness, but is that even possible given that how different people are and how different environments are?
I would say, as an anthropologist, no, it's not possible to standardize ways that you prepare. I think, but there can be a common language that people could speak, I suppose. But there, I think we need to pay attention to how different people around the world would interpret that language. I think there is a tension between, in disaster research, I feel a tension between people who are policy oriented. So they want to come up with policies and approaches that can be applied universally. And I understand why, because we need practical solutions to being better, to be better prepared for disasters. But as an anthropologist, I find that problematic and not quite satisfying, because that on the ground, there are more interesting things happening. People adapt, people coming up with their own ways of being prepared for disasters. So I do feel a tension between, the practical aspect and the other observations that I have. So for example, I've been working with a municipality in Chile called Talcahuano. It's in the southern western coast. And they have a disaster risk reduction office in the town, which is quite rare. And I've been following the man who heads that department, called Boris. And I'm using his real name because he told me he doesn't want me to use a pseudonym because even though that's what we do in anthropology. But anyway, so yeah, Boris. And when I observed his work, one of the things I noticed is that he puts on these activities for communities, around children, often to be prepared for disasters, so on. But in the lead up to having this event, he has multiple meetings with lots of different people, and he changes the message a little bit every time so that everybody feels invested in the work that, in the work of putting together this event. And I found that really interesting because, again, it's about incompleteness. And the way that he translates the project slightly differently depending on the person, depending on the audience, to try to get everyone involved in this work of preparedness. And I find that really interesting and important to pay attention to, again, so that we create spaces for people like that to adapt the message in the way that they see fit. But that's not something that policymakers care about or are interested in, because it's about a guy who goes around having lots of meetings. For policymakers, it doesn't really matter. But I think taking that into consideration is really important, so that we don't come up with a standard way of doing disaster risk reduction that is not relevant to the people in that place.
It sounds like, from a practical perspective, it sounds like there's a lot of creativity involved in sort of getting the messaging across. Now, I mean, judging by what I've seen, policy, lacks creativity completely. And so, when you have the clash of these two, who ultimately wins? Who ultimately gets their way?
Oh, that's a good question. I think who ultimately gets the way will be the people in power, and whether that's a policy person or a more creatively oriented person. I think that doesn't matter as much as the power that person has in an institution, or and I have to say that creative approaches are not necessarily outside policy. There is an international network called Resilient Cities or something like that. It comes out of the Rockefeller Foundation. I hope I'm getting that right. I can't remember. But recently I went to an online event that they had that was about paying attention to the role of play in cities, and how play, centering playfulness in urban design or urban usage can actually help with resilience. And these are policymakers and people in power who are running this program. So I don't think that creative or approaches are necessarily outside of policy. But I think that even then there might be a tendency to say, okay, if play is important, then every city needs to do 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And that
exactly,
yeah. So I think you need to be really careful, to still leave some room for maneuver and openness, and the fact that you can't control how people are going to use these methods.
And I think this is really interesting, because you mentioned this idea of games and gearing it towards children. Can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Yeah. So there's one board game or card game. So all of these games I've been looking at have been developed by this nonprofit organization in Japan called Plus Arts. And of course, the people in Chile make up their own games as well. But one of the games that Plus Arts has is they have pictures and they have drawings of different scenarios of a disaster. And there's an adult, facilitator who tells the story. And for example, there's a picture of an aftermath of an earthquake. It's cartoon, so it's not really scary. And there's a man who's trapped under a wardrobe that's fallen on him. And the question is, what item do you need in order to save this man? And there are 4 or 5 children playing. Then they each have a set of cards with different items. So there might be a long piece of wood, a forklift, a rope, a newspaper, a handkerchief, let's say. And the child has to decide which item out of the cards that they have, is going to help the person. And they have to choose some things, and they have to explain why they would use that. So for example, they might not have anything that seems that useful, but they might say, it's okay, the best thing I could offer is a handkerchief, because then I can at least wipe their forehead or something. But each answer is associated with a number of points. And so in that question, the highest point goes to the long piece of wood, because you can use that to create a lever and then lift up the furniture. And the reason why that's the correct answer with the highest points is because it's based on research that they did with survivors of the 1995 Kobe earthquake. And according to those interviews, they said, pieces of wood were the most helpful thing, because it wasn't a machine, so you didn't need to have the license to operate a machine. it was readily available. It was the most useful thing you could have to save people under furniture. So, that's one example of a game that they might do.
It's also very interesting because like the rules aren't predetermined, because you're giving a kid the opportunity to explain themselves and justify, which in itself is powerful for their own development, because they start to reason, why am I using this? So I think it's very powerful. How much has this sort of thing been incorporated into disaster preparedness just in between those two countries?
So I think, how much has it been incorporated, I guess, by who might be the question, or where. So in Japan, it's very popular, and they're often done by community organizations or neighborhood associations. They call up the the nonprofit, and they say they want to do it. They get some training and they do it. So this has happened, across hundreds of locations across Japan. And the Japanese government also showcases it as as something that they teach international experts who come. So they say, this is something that you could do. So people in in around the Asia Pacific who have taken the training have done it in their countries. In Chile, so in Talcahuano, Boris does a lot of these, similar kinds of activities. And there are other municipalities in Chile that have done them or tried to do them, but I think it hasn't taken off in the way that they would have liked. I think one, because you do need someone like Boris who can translate these activities to a local context. And as I mentioned, he puts a lot of really, tedious effort into making it happen by going to meetings, explaining the activities several times to different actors. And I think it's just the people don't have the time to do that translation work. But I think that the attention to children as actors of disaster preparedness is quite popular. And you see that in England or in the UK and across Europe as well.
Disaster preparedness as a sort of looking at disaster preparedness through the lens of anthropology, what insights have you got from doing this kind of research over the period of time that you started it?
I think I think one is, this attention to incompleteness of translations that I was mentioning. That there's, I've always been, as an anthropologist, skeptical of standardized methods, I suppose, and policies. But I didn't really understand the extent to which it's important to be adaptable and flexible. And I think a lot of people would agree that that might be the definition of resilience, right? It is about being prepared and having an emergency backpack and knowing your hazard map and your evacuation routes. But it's also about, when the disaster strikes, being able to act in the moment and make a decision depending on the situation, and not follow what you've learned. And that's really surprising to me, because a lot of these trainings and disaster organizations have very specific things that they're teaching people. But at the end of the training or at the end of a conversation, they would say, but when the disaster strikes, forget everything we've taught you and just do what you think is right in that moment. Just act in the moment, make a decision that based on all these tools that we've given you. So that kind of, teaching, but then telling them, no, don't be trapped by everything we've taught you.
Yeah.
Interesting. And difficult to turn into a standardized thing, I suppose.
That's such a eloquent way of putting it. Like, don't be trapped by what we've taught you. Because I think it's a tendency, not just in those situations, in any situations, for anyone to be trapped by what they've been taught. So I think that is such a powerful way of putting it. How would you sell this branch of anthropology to prospective researchers and students?
Ooh, another good question. I would say because anthropology always pays attention to alternative stories or things that other people might not have noticed, or they destabilize what people think is common sense, that kind of, other perspective might be what we need in order to really know how to prepare for disasters. As we've seen, it strikes everywhere. It's becoming, with climate change, disasters are going to get worse and more frequent. And we're going to need, new ways, creative ways, maybe, ways that we haven't even imagined yet, to be able to, to survive. And I think on the one hand, yes, we need to advocate for governments, and corporations and people in power to make sure that disasters don't happen. Because as disaster scholars often say, it's not the hazard itself that causes devastation, right? Disaster is a combination of the natural hazard, so of the hurricane, plus the infrastructure that wasn't strong enough and therefore the building fell down, right? So a disaster is always man-made, in one way or another, because it's, they say if it's a deserted island and there's a hurricane, it doesn't matter, like nothing happened, there's no disaster, right? So yeah, on the one hand, we need to, advocate for those in power to make sure that the infrastructure is good for everyone, because yeah, we know vulnerable people tend to live in vulnerable spaces. But on the other hand, I think that there are, as the disasters become bigger, it's going to be harder and harder for emergency services to come right away, and governments to step in right away. And so, each of us, every community, every family is going to need to have the tools to at least survive the first week, or in Japan, we say the first week or the first month. So, we're going to need different ways for people to figure out how to do that, and, give them tools to do that. And for that, I think it's also important to, have, be able to come up with alternative, new ways to make people, realize that that's important.
I think you're spot on, because, the sort of climate change and various other things have just shown that, disasters are becoming far more frequent. And, people like yourself who study this and, can identify some key issues and areas that need improving, do make a substantial, difference, in the way we think about things. So I think it's a fundamental piece of anthropology that, we'd love to sort of see open up a bit more. Where do you see your work going from here?
I think so. One of the things that I've been interested in are the assumptions about society that are embedded in preparedness approaches. So one paper that I'm working on is about conceptions of the household that are embedded in preparedness efforts. So, and I think we've seen this with COVID, this assumption that households are made up of a nuclear family, or they live in the same structure, the same house complex. But that's not necessarily the case, right? A household or a kinship structure, as we've seen in COVID, can span different so-called households, right? People will have, a family has been supporting each other across 3 different houses, for example, right? Extended family members have always been there and supported each other. But that's not really embedded in preparedness policies. And another thing is that a lot of preparedness and disaster response also has a gendered perspective of households. So there's this idea that women are going to be the caretakers, or, they provide the childcare. Or, in Japan, a lot of household preparedness, let's say, is about stocking up, stockpiling food, emergency food or water, keeping on top of what are the most recent hazard maps or evacuation routes. And it's a lot of work, I think this is one of the things with preparedness, as I mentioned with bodies, with meetings, it's a lot of work to do preparedness. And so most people are too busy with everyday lives to do it or to even think about it. And often it falls on the women and mothers to do a lot of this work. My mother, for example, she has lots of bottled water that she keeps, but they have expiration dates. So you have to stay on top of circulating that water and replacing it with new water. And same with emergency food, you have to keep on top of the expiration rate and rotate them. And my mother spends quite a bit of time doing that rotation and figuring out when the water is expiring, buying new ones, and so on. And so there's a lot of that kind of assumptions about kinship that are, I think, embedded in disaster risk reduction or preparedness policies. And ideas of kinship, what constitutes a family, what are the different responsibilities in a family? Those are questions that anthropologists have asked for a long time. What does it mean to belong in a family? All of that. And so that's one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about, and especially in the context of countries like Japan, or even in Europe, across Europe, of falling birth rates, a lot of single person households, a lot of elderly households. So this assumption that a household or a family is going to be constituted by a father, a mother, and in Japan, father, mother, 2 children, right? That's like the model in Japan. That's not really as prevalent as it has been. A lot of people in Japan live alone, so then how do you think about, community-based preparedness when people, increasingly live alone? So those are the kinds of questions that
very interesting questions, very, very insightful questions too. Where can people find you online?
Sorry?
Where can people find you online?
If you Google me, I suppose, it'll be on the university research site and university departmental page. I'm also on Twitter.
If you send over the handle, we'll just plug it into the episode so people can see it. Well, Chika, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I hope that we can bring you back for some of your future work, because I think it's incredibly important and insightful. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.